Let me begin with a few questions. Who knows who wrote the Siddur? Who knows when the Siddur was written? Who knows how long it took for the Siddur to be written? Who knows if one can add prayers to the Siddur? Or one can add words? Or if one can remove certain prayers from the Siddur? These questions are vexing questions, difficult questions, challenging questions. And most amazing, if you go back to your house today, I would almost guarantee that the sefer, the book that you have the most of in your house, is the Siddur. The book that most of us use most prominently daily is the Siddur. The book that every man, woman, and child uses from nursery school until 120 is the Siddur. But the Siddur is the most cryptic, challenging, difficult, and unknown work to each and every single one of us. And that dichotomy is what led me close to 10 years ago to begin to research the Siddur and to try to understand how can it be the book that I use the most and each of you use the most, that each of us have the most of, and that our kids use. We know so little about, we even can't answer the most basic questions as to who wrote it, when it was written, how long it took to be written. Can you add? Who added them? Who authored the prayers? That is the basic of the book, The Making of the Siddur, and that is the basis of the short presentation this morning. My winter told me I only have till about 12:30. So I'm going to do my best. The room was reserved to 1, so we can maybe push it a little bit longer. But if all is well, I'll try to cover this in about 45 minutes or an hour. And if not, you will be able to keep in touch with me, and I hope you will appreciate and learn the book, especially in this time of year. Tshuva, Tfilu, Tzedakah, Ma'avir Nezroa HaGzera. As we enter the month of Elul, as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, there's no question that the primary focus of the Yomim Nora'im, of the days of awe, is certainly prayer. And one of the memories that I have, actually, when this really began to challenge me, is when I began to open up the Machzor one year and started to get very, very lost and confused. Why are we saying this? Where does this come from? Why is this being printed? Who added this prayer? Should I say this prayer? Can I skip this prayer? These are the questions that I like to focus on. There's a very well-known rabbi, some of you may have heard of, Rabbi Shlomo Volbe is his name. Rabbi Volbe was a well-known orator, a very well-known lecturer, a very tremendous thinker, one of the great Baalei Musar of the last generation, died close to 25 years ago. I was privileged to hear some of his classes in Eretz Yisrael. And in the beginning of the first volume of his work, Alei Shor, in the second chapter, listen to what he says about the Siddur. One line. HaSiddur hu HaSefer ha'amuk v'hakasha biyoseh. The Siddur is the most difficult, complex, deep work. Mikol HaSfarim b'Torah Sheba'al Peh. Of all of the works written by the sages of Torah Sheba'al Peh. It means from Chazal, from the Talmud and the Mishnah. Shenchilu Rabbeinu Chazal. It means that the Siddur is the most difficult book, harder than Maseches Yevamos, more difficult than the Mishnayos and Maseches Nida, more complicated than the tractates of Krisus and Kachim and Taras. Says Rav Volbe, the Siddur is the most complex book that our rabbis have written. And it's the book, again, that we really need to understand and need to focus on. Let's go back and see the history, the development, the origin of the Siddur, where it came from, and who wrote many of the Tfilos and how it developed over the years. Let me start with the Rambam. The Rambam in Hilchos Tfilah, in Perek Aleph Halacha Daled, tells us the beginning of the history of the Siddur. And listen to the words of Maimonides. The Rambam writes, Kevan Shegol Yisod b'mei Nebuchadnezzar, the first temple period, when Nebuchadnezzar exiled and the diaspora of the Jewish people took them out of the land of Israel to Bavel, Nis'arvu b'paras v'yavon, the Jewish people became interspersed, intermingled, assimilated amongst the Persians and many other of the nations, including the Babylonians. V'noldu lahem banim b'aretz hagoyim, and they began to have children in the diaspora. The first time that the Jewish community began to assimilate and began to find themselves in host countries that were not necessarily comfortable with the Jewish community. V'nisbalbel asfasa, the language of Hebrew that the Jewish community was familiar with became confused, and they were unaware of the local host languages. Their children began to speak the local languages. And the Rambam goes through the various different languages that they began to speak. As a result of this, the children in elementary school and in nursery school and in high school, the Jewish students who were assimilated and began to become exiled in Babylonia, they didn't know how to pray. They were lost. There was no language that they could pray. They didn't know Hebrew anymore. And what were they to do? So says the Rambam, as a result of that, an individual came. And who was that individual? His name was Ezra HaSofer. And Ezra HaSofer decided that we needed to create a language and a work and a body to allow the Jewish people to be able to pray properly. And says the Rambam, that's exactly what Ezra HaSofer did. As time went on, he began to establish a language called Hebrew, and a siddur that the people would be able to use in order to pray properly. So did that work? Did Ezra's solution work? By creating and organizing Tfilos Yisrael, the Gemara says in Mesachas Megillah Daf Lamed Gimel, that Ezra, the Beis Din, and the Ashkenazi and Rishonim established 4 things. Tfilos, brachos, kedushos, v'havdalos. Prayers, blessings, kedusha, and havdalah. It's a very limited amount of things that Ezra established. It means the tefillah of Ezra was somewhat limited, but appreciate that also, that from the time of Avram, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachaleh, through Moshe Rabbeinu, up until Ezra HaSofer, who lived roughly 2,000 years ago, there was no established framework for tefillah. And the Rambam makes that very clear. Avram, Yitzchak, Yaakov, Sarah, Rivka, Rachaleh, Moshe Rabbeinu, they prayed when they wanted to, how they wanted to, when they wanted to. You're all jealous, but that's what they did. Whatever they wanted to pray, how long they wanted to pray, that's what they did. Ezra said, no, we need to change that. We need to establish and concretize prayer in a way that the Jewish people in exile will be able to speak to God and have a conversation and communicate with God. So Ezra did something very dramatic, because until then, throughout Jewish history, in the biblical time period of the prophets, throughout Tanakh, up until the end of Tanakh, Ezra and Nehemiah brought the Jewish community back from Babel to Eretz Yisrael. Only at the end of the period of Tanakh was there established Seder HaTfilah. But did Ezra write a Siddur? They didn't write a Siddur. There's nothing written. Ezra didn't write anything down. He established Tfilah, which is Shmona Esrei, the Gemara says in Mesachos Brachos, and Daf Lamed Gimel, that he established what we refer to as Shmona Esrei, the 18 blessings, along with Kedushos and Havdalos, Brachos and Tfilos, a very limited set of prayer, but it was not written down. Now, did that work? Was there success? So Gemara has another very cryptic comment in Mesachas Megillah Daf Yud Zayin. Says there was a man by the name of Shimon HaPikuli. Who was Shimon HaPikuli? If you don't know, don't be shy, don't be embarrassed, because nobody knows who he is. You know what a Pikuli is? A Pikuli is a cotton worker. Shimon HaPikuli, if I'm not mistaken, this is the only time we find his name in all of Shas, from Mesachas Moed until Seder Kachim and Taras. We don't know who exactly he was. He was a cotton picker. And the Gemara says about Shimon HaPikuli in Mesachas Megillah Daf Yud Zayin that he established the Shmona Esrei. The Gemara says he established the Shmona Esrei. That doesn't make sense. It can't be Ezra HaSofer established the Shmona Esrei. As the Gemara says in Brachos, who is Shimon HaPikuli anyway? And how did he establish Shmona Esrei? So listen to what the Gemara says, and this is the ultimate truth of the Jewish history. Shachachum v'chazru v'hiskinu. The Jewish people forgot what Ezra taught them. The Jewish community forgot that Ezra and the Ashkenazi established prayer. They forgot it. Jewish history is full of challenges and tribulations and terrible situations, and the Jewish people are unable to commit themselves to knowing what exactly Ezra, Sofer, and Ashkenazi taught them several hundred years earlier. So this gentleman named Shimon HaPikuli in the cotton fields said, we're all lost, I don't know how to pray. And he established and re-established prayer. So as we begin to see, and this is the story of Jewish history throughout the Tanakh and throughout this time period of the Mishnah and the Talmud, it wasn't so simple. Things were forgotten, things were lost, nothing was written down. That's what the Gemara says in Mesachas Gittin and Daf Samech, that the rabbis were forced to write down Torah Shebal Peh. The Torah was not meant to be written down. The Torah is meant to be passed down generation to generation. It's a Masorah, it's a tradition. From Rebbe to Talmud, parent to child. But we were forced to because of the dispersion and the exile and the diaspora that we found ourselves in, just like it was true about the Mishnah, the Gemara was true about the Siddur as well. So now that Shimon HaPikuli established Tfilah, and we had Shmona Esrei, we knew some of the brachos and the tfilos and the kedushos and the havdalos, would that save prayer? Was Jewish prayer now concretized and established for posterity? The answer is no. Because in the 9th century, a letter was sent from Barcelona to Babel. In Barcelona in the 800s was a very significant Jewish community in Spain, and the Jews of Spain were lost. And they too write that they didn't know how to pray. appreciate how rich we are today and how knowledgeable we are today, how educated we are today. The Jews of Barcelona, of Spain, and the surrounding countries did not know how to pray. Ezra HaSofer and Ashkenazi never wrote anything down. They couldn't write anything down. Shimon Apikuli reestablished Tefillah several hundred years later, and here we find ourselves in the early 800s, and the people in Spain, where the Jewish community was very vibrant, did not know how to pray. What did they do? They send a letter to Bavel, to Surah, to Pumbedisa, to the great Gaon, Rav Amram. And they tell Rav Amram Gaon, who was the leading rabbinic authority in all of the land of Israel and beyond, we don't know how to pray. Write down for us a Seder HaTfilah. That's what the Jews of Barcelona, of Spain, write to Rav Amram Gaon. Write down for us a Seder HaTfilah. There's something called a pen and a paper, which we're not so familiar with today. Then it was a quill and ink. And Rav Amram Gaon responded with a Seder Rav Amram Gaon, which became the first written Siddur that we are familiar with. Rav Amram Gaon died in the year 875, if history is correct on that one. And that is the first Siddur that we have. If you take a look in the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon, and you pick that up and try to use it this morning for Shachar, you'll be lost. You won't be able to make heads and tails. You'll be confused because it looks nothing like the Siddur that you held in your hand this morning, or that you're holding in your hand this afternoon, this evening, or the Machzor that you'll have. It's not going to work. But Rav Amram's Seder was the first time anything was actually written down and anything was actually published as a work telling and committing the Jewish people what to write, how to write, and how to pray. That's the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon. And it's a critical work because it's the first time that we have anything written down. And that is the source of many of the tefillos that we have today, comes from the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon. So in the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon, you open it up, and I have 4 different works of the Seder of Amram Gaon. You will see there how tefillah begins to take shape, but again, it looks nothing like the Siddur you're holding. Now I ask you, did that help? Did the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon help?
Yes.
Yes.
Yes and no. Yes, because we finally have something written down, but no, because this is well before the printing press. Roughly 500 years before the printing press. And what happened is that everybody wanted to get a hold of the work of Rav Amram Gaon because it was a critical work. And what happens prior to the printing press when people want to get a hold of the Seder and works and manuscripts? Edits are made. And this chazan adds this, and this chazan adds that. Not you. You wouldn't add anything to the Siddur. I know you're chazan. But everybody starts to pick and choose and add a little bit here and a little bit there, and that's why I have multiple copies of the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon. Many scholarly editions have been written since, with many of the different nuschos that have emerged from the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon, but it was an extraordinary help. And the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon is quoted by the greatest halachic authorities from the Rishonim, including the great codes of Jewish law, the Torah, the Beis Yosef, all refer to the Seder of Rav Amram Gaon as the ultimate and first work where everything begins to be established. Roughly 100 years later, another great Gaon, Reb Saadia Gaon, was the second most significant Siddur to be written, as I said, roughly 100 years later, and we could talk about a lot of the differences between the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon and the Siddur of Reb Saadia Gaon. The Siddur of Reb Saadia Gaon is a little less known than the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon. It's not as widely quoted by halachic authorities. Rav Amram Gaon didn't always keep in line with what the Beis Medrash of the Gaonim posited in terms of psak halacha. It was also not written in Lashon HaKodesh, and therefore the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon did not carry the same weight, same gravitas, and didn't have the same teeth in terms of the development of the Siddur as the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon, but nonetheless it continued to establish what we have as our Siddur. But something very dramatic happened, and this is a correspondence that took place between Spain and Bavel, and here's where we get and we move to France. And in France something very, very significant happened, and that is the Beis Medrash of Rashi. Rashi, who you're familiar with as the classical commentary on the Chumash, on the Nevi'im, on the Ksuvim, and throughout Shas. And Rashi's commentary is critically important to understand many, many areas of Torah Shebachsav. And in his Beis Medrash and his students authored the Siddur. And the most significant Siddur that emerged from the Beis Medrash of Rashi was a Siddur called the Machzor Vitri. And before we explain who the Machzor Vitri is and what the Machzor Vitri did, I just want to explain what a Siddur is and what a Machzor is. On Rosh Hashanah, Yom Kippur, the Yom Tovim, and the Yomim, Nora'im use a Machzor. Every single day you use a Siddur. Why did the Machzor Vitri, written by Rabbi Simcha Vitri, who was a student, one of the outstanding disciples of Rashi, refer to his work as a Machzor as opposed to a Siddur? It would seem, and if you use the work of the Machzor Vitri, that the Machzor is actually not only a book of prayers, but it's a book that explains and does a lot more than just write and articulate the prayers. The Siddur of the Machzor Vitri goes through an entire canon of the entire year. It goes through all the prayers that we say from morning to evening with explanation, with details, with the piyutim, which we don't have enough time to talk about this morning. But the Machzor Vitri is an all-encompassing work. Today has been printed scholarly by an individual, by a group, and there are about 6 volumes in the Siddur of the Machzor Vitri, and it's extraordinary work. And what the Machzor Vitri did is begin to really formalize and to organize tefillah in a much easier way. And today, if you open up the Machzor Vitri, although you'll also be a bit lost because you'll have to turn pages and you won't see all the prayers and you're not familiar with them, if you take time and you start to use the Siddur of the Machzor Vitri, Simcha Vitri, you'll begin to see prayer formulated, developed, and it's starting to become much closer to what you are familiar with. So that takes us from Babel to Spain and France, and I want to bring you to Germany. In Germany, roughly 100 years later, a very important group of rabbis referred to as the Hasidei Ashkenaz. The Hasidei Ashkenaz began with Rabbi Yehuda HaChassid and another rabbi, well-known rabbi, the Rokeach, Rabbi Elazar Rokeach, and this is roughly in the 1000s and the 1100s. And these rabbis of Germany were Ashkenaz, but they were also ascetics. They were very pious and very spiritual, and they had a very big impact on the Siddur. And if you take a look in this group of rabbis, primarily the Rokeach, the Siddur of the Rokeach, the Siddur of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, they do something that we have not yet found either in the Siddur of Rambam or the Siddur of Reb Saadia Gaon or the Siddur of the Machzor Vitri or in the works of the Rambam. And what they did is they began to count words. And if you look at the tour throughout Hilchos Tefillah, the tour refers to the Hasidei Ashkenaz, the first of the Rokeach regularly. And what the Rokeach did, what the Yehuda HaChassid did, what the Hasidei Ashkenaz did, is they'll go through the Shemona Esrei and they'll count how many words are in the paragraph in the passage of Elam Al-Shinu. They'll count how many words are in the passage of Baruch Aleinu. They'll count how many words are Modim, and it will correspond to that amount of words in a certain pasuk. So therefore, the Hasidei Ashkenaz's contribution to the Siddur was almost like what the Rishonim did on Shas. They began to be medayik. They began to read the words of the text of the Siddur very carefully and to try to understand, why are there this many words in this blessing? Why are there this many words in that blessing? And why do this amount of words correspond to this pasuk? And why does this pasuk correspond to what was said in this blessing? And thus the Hasidei Ashkenaz made a very significant contribution to the Siddur, and the Siddur again begins to develop as we move from Babel and Spain to France to Germany, and that is where we find the Siddur roughly in the year 1200. What happens for the next few hundred years is that the Rishonim, including the Rambam who lived a little bit earlier, Rashi who I just referred to as well, and if all the Rishonim that you're familiar with began to publish, to pen, or explain the Siddur. And this was a very significant time period, flourishing time period throughout Jewish history, where the Rishonim began to pen Siddurim, explain the Siddur, and if you take a look in any library, any decent base medrash, you'll see tens upon tens of Siddurim being published during that time period of the Rishonim. And what the Rishonim did is they wrote their Siddur the way they received their tradition, whether it's from Italy, whether it's from France, or whether it's from Germany, each Siddur adding another significant layer and contribution to what the Siddur did. But then in the year 1500 something happened, not in Spain, not in Babel, not in Germany, but in Eretz Yisrael. The most dramatic contributions to the Siddur took place in a small city in the north of Israel called Tzfas. And Tzfas is where the great Kabbalists and the Kabbalim lived, and included in that list, of course, is Rabbi Yosef Karo, the Seder Haredim, the Seder Hayom, Moshe ben Machir, Moshe Cordovero, the Arizal, of course, Reb Chaim Vital, a very great group of rabbis. And you should know, if you're familiar, in history, it's a fascinating dynamic that occurred. Tzfas was a much more important city than Yerushalayim. Tzfas was where the stronghold of the rabbinic great foothold of classical, strong rabbinic leadership was. Yerushalayim was paled, actually, in comparison to many debates and challenges that took place between Yerushalayim and Tzfas, including the great Smicha controversy between the Maharabach and the Rabbi Yosef Karo and his Rebbe. But in Tzfas, the Mekubalim began to write and add significant amounts to the Siddur. What's the most significant addition that the Mekubalim made to the Siddur? Kabbalah Shabbos. And if we had time, we could spend hours talking about Kabbalah Shabbos and appreciate for a moment the tefillah that probably, if I would ask you to raise your hands, that most of you love the most, is not found in the Rambam. It's not found in Rashi. Not in the Ritva, not in the Rashba, not in the Hasidei Ashkenaz, and not from Germany, not from Italy, not from Spain, but it emerges from a small little village, a hamlet in the north of Israel called Tzfas. And I don't believe, and if you read the writings of the Mekubalim of that era, take a look in the Seder Hayom, how he describes the development of Kabbalah Shabbos, none of them would have imagined that Kabbalah Shabbos would become what it became. And how did they do that? As I just noted moments ago, to add to the Siddur a phrase, a word, a paragraph, a passage that is very, very delicate and dangerous, and we'll talk about it momentarily. When, who, if, yes, no, permitted, prohibited. All of a sudden, the Mekubalim of Tzfas, led probably by two brothers-in-law, Rabbi Moshe and Shlomo Alkovitz, established Kabbalah Shabbos, and nobody almost said boo. It was picked up lock, stock, and barrel, even in Germany, slowly, as the Siddur Avodas Yisrael writes from Seligman there, Pashta b'chol ha'olam la'at la'at. Kabbalah Shabbos began to become established very, very slowly. It moved from Tzfas to Yerushalayim, from Yerushalayim to Egypt, from Egypt throughout the Middle East, from the Middle East began to expand and expound, and it became a very significant prayer. And these Mekubalim, not only did they add the tefillah of Kabbalah Shabbos, they added another critical tefillah, which many of us may or may not be familiar with, but they added a prayer. It's called Yom Kippur Katan. If you've heard of Yom Kippur Katan, it's a tefillah that is recited Erev Rosh Chodesh. Some yeshivas recite it, some shuls do or do not recite it, but an entire tefillah that they added called Yom Kippur Katan. And we'll talk about a little of the other additions that took place as well from the Chachmei Tzfas. So here you begin to see a roughly 500 years of work of development. So typically, when you ask somebody who wrote the Siddur, they'll often respond the Anshe Knesset Agdola. Now that's true, but that's not true. It's an elementary level answer. It's true, Ezra HaSofer established tfilos, kedushos, havdalos, and brachos, but he didn't write a siddur. And he didn't necessarily opine when, how, if it should be written, but it was a necessary. And then from there went to Shimon Apikuli, from Shimon Apikuli went to Rav Ramri to Reb Siddur, to the Rambam, and to Rashi, and from Rashi to the Hasidei Ashkenaz, from the Hasidei Ashkenaz to the Mekubalim of Tzfas. We're talking about 500 years of the Siddur being written by great scholars, by Rabbanim, by philosophers, by Mekubalim, by Medaktikim, by grammarians, and by a very wide gamut of Gaonim, Rishonim, and Achronim who are adding their specific talent to the Siddur. So Siddur arguably is the longest work in the book to ever be written, and it doesn't stop there. Because if you continue to follow the history and the development of the Siddur is far from finished. Because if you take a look in the subsequent generations and epochs and years, the Siddur becomes more and more dynamic. And one of the next levels of development of the Siddur takes place amongst the Hasidim and the Hasidic masters, 1700s, the 1800s, the Baal Shem Tov, and his students begin to write what's called Nusach Sfard. And again, we're limited in terms of the time to explain what Nusach Sfard is and how Nusach Sfard works, but appreciate for a moment, we begin to see in that generation different dialects and different words being added to the Siddur. And where are they coming from? Could they not add? That was one of the great cause célèbres of that generation, between the Chassam Sofer and his student, the Maram Shik in Hungary, and the Hasidic masters. Where and how are they permitted to add words to the Siddur? The Hasidei Ashkenaz of Germany limited and counted the letters and the numbers. Where do they have the goal, the right, the audacity, and the authority to start adding words to the Siddur? Is that feasible? Is that possible? And this became a great debate, which took place over 100 plus years between some of the great Hasidic masters. You can look in the works of the Devrei Chaim, the Munkat Shirav, the Minchas Elazar, who discuss very, very heavily, begin to try to explain and to reconcile what they did, why they did, and could they do that. The Chassam Sofer responds, the Maram Shik responds, and this debate goes on throughout hundreds of years, trying to understand and to appreciate. And then comes the Vilna Gaon, in something that we refer to as the Nusach HaGra. The Vilna Gaon died in the year 1808. And the Vilna Gaon, if you think he wrote a Siddur, you're wrong. The Vilna Gaon never wrote a Siddur. And if we refer to what we call the Nusach HaGra, where did the Nusach HaGra come from? The Gra didn't write a Siddur. The Gra was much too busy to write a Siddur. He was busy writing on all other areas of Jewish and religious and rabbinic scholarship. But the Nusach HaGra comes from 2 or 3 places. It comes from the Gra's writings in his Bir HaGra and Shulchan Aruch, where he talks about Hilchos Tefillah, some very patchwork comments of the Vilna Gaon there, as well as from his students in the Sefer Ma'aser Rav, as well as in his commentary Imrei Noam Maseches Brachos, where the Gra begins to talk about Tefillah and make comments about Tefillah. But the Gra never wrote a Siddur. But the Nusach HaGra became very significant in Eretz Yisrael. When his students moved to Eretz Yisrael, what you call the first wave of the Aliyah to Eretz Yisrael, the students of the Vilna Gaon came to Yerushalayim and they spread themselves out, and the Siddur of the Gra became a very significant Siddur, because what the Siddur of the Gra did was something dramatic that was not seen in hundreds of years. And you're going to appreciate the Gra for this. The Gra limited Tefillah. And the Gra said there's too much. And the Gra was a strong opponent of adding anything to the Siddur. The Vilna Gaon was very, very adamant, and this is what his students in Chaim Balashim refer to as Dina de Gemara. You're only supposed to pray based upon the things that it says absolutely must be prayed in the Gemara. Or prayers of Rabbi Elazar HaKalir, one of the great Jewish liturgists, Kabbalists. The Gra felt that he wrote everything al pi Kabbalah, and he understood what he was writing, and therefore that could be written. If there's time, we'll talk about one of the great prayers that the Vilna Gaon was a great opponent of. Anybody know? Dan, you know. Yigdal. The Vilna Gaon was a great opponent of the early prayer. If you said it this morning, it's okay. But the Vilna Gaon had very strong opposition to the prayer of Yigdal. He also had strong opposition, if we have time talking about this morning, something that I'm sure anybody in shul said this morning. Do you know what that is? What? LeDavid. Anybody say LeDavid this morning? Not the Vilna Gaon. How could you say LeDavid? Where did the LeDavid come from? Who put that in the Siddur? Where did that come from? Who added that? And you know what else the Vilna Gaon writes, and his students write in Ma'aser Rav? You're making tefillah too long. They just finished Mizmor Shil Yom HaShabbos. They just finished Hayom Rishon. What are you adding LeDavid Hashem Ori Mishi for? It's enough. Tirka the Tzibura. Stop adding prayers. And the Vilna Gaon was very, very meticulous, very adamant that you shouldn't add prayers, because who authored the prayers? Who wrote the prayers? We didn't even get to that. And we'll talk about that momentarily. Who wrote Adon Olam? Who wrote Yigdal? Well, we know who wrote Shemon Esrei. That was Ezra Sof and Ashkenazi and Rishonim Pikuli helped concretize that. Shema, we know, was written, and if you look in early tshuvos of the Gaon, you know what was being prayed in the first temple period, in the second temple period, you know how long Shach took? Maybe 3 minutes. They said the Aseres Adibros, they said Shema, they said Berachos Kriya Shema, and Shemona Esrei, that was it. Very, very short fair, and Tefillah began to become longer and longer. Where did Psukei de Zimra come from? Does it say that anywhere in the Talmud they have to say Psukei de Zimra? Will you find Baruch Shamar and Yishtabach in the Talmud? Will you find it authorized? Not Baruch Shamar, not Yishtabach. You will find certain statements that Psukei de Zimra should be recited, but how much of Psukei de Zimra? What is Psukei de Zimra? Which passages? Why do we start from 146 and go to 150? The last 5 chapters beginning with Ashrei until Kol HaNeshama T'Halakah. Who added the second words? Kol HaNeshama T'Halakah Aluka. Where did that come from? Look in Tehillim, it's not there. Who put in Hichvot? Who put in Mizmor Lasoda? Who added Vayevarech? Where did the Hodu come from? Hodu, by the way, is the most prominent debate between Hasidim and Misnagdim. Anybody here David Nusach Sfard? Now, man of my heart. Nusach Sfard, you know what they start with? Hodu. You know what we start with? Baruch Shamar. This is one of the great debates between Hasidim and Misnagdim. And you think that's a small debate? This was considered the most significant debate, and it has to do with Kabbalistic intent. Very significant Kabbalistic intent. Do you start with Baruch Shamar? Do you start with Hodu? Where does the tefillah begin? But who says to start Hodu? Who put Hodu into the Siddur? It's a great debate between the Rif and Rashi, Maseches Brachos, and other scholars. And the machlokas is very significant, because I know nobody comes late to shul here. But I'll tell you, it is significant. Because this machlokas between Rashi and the Rif, as to what is the critical component of Psukei de Zimra, is the subject of, if you come late to shul, which passages and paragraphs should you recite? Should you say Baruch Shamar, Yishtabach, and Ashrei? Which of the Hallelujah should you add? I know it's the last thing to skip. Yichvod. You know what Yichvod is right before Ashrei? Yichvod is an amalgam of different psukim throughout Psukim Dezirah. That's not one passage, that's not a chapter in Tehillim. It's a variety of different verses of psukim that are brought throughout Tanakh that was placed right before Ashrei. But who added that? Where did that come from? How could that be added? And these are some of the debates and the questions that exist regarding the Siddur. How was the Siddur written? Who wrote the prayers? And how is it feasible and how is it possible? After the Vilna Gaon, in the early 1800s, again the Siddur does not stop being developed. Now it slows down to a certain extent, and now begins the generation of compiling, of explaining, just like the Achronim do in Shas. They begin to look back at the works of the Rishonim and try to decipher and to analyze and to crystallize what just happened over the last 1,000 years. Where did this tefillos come from? Who created and who authored the Siddur? Who authored this work? And many very critical and important Siddurim began to be written to arrange and to organize and to crystallize the Siddur. The work that was most significant in the research that I did, or one of two of the works that are most significant in the research that I did and began my interest in the Siddur, is a work called the Otzer HaTfilos. The Otzer HaTfilos was written in 1914, published in roughly 1914. And it's not one person who authored it. There are probably upwards of 10 different commentaries in the Siddur Otzer HaTfilos. It's actually being republished by two different organizations, scholars, one in Israel and one in America, are reworking the Siddur Otzer HaTfilos. Probably 50, 60, and 70 years ago, if you have an old library, you look in your library, you probably have a Siddur Otzer HaTfilos, a very significant Siddur. Many of you may have received it for a bar mitzvah present. It's 2 volumes, it's very old. It's printed both of the commentary in Nusach Ashkenaz and Nusach Sfard. And the Siddur Otzer HaTfilos compiles many very important works on the Siddur, explaining the phraseology, the words, and the source of the tefillah. 2 of the most prominent works in there are called the Tikkun Tefillah and the Iyun Tefillah, written by Rabbi Shlomo Gordon. And another work that's written there is the Anaf Yosef, the Eitz Yosef, which is the commentary on the Enyaka by Rabbi Zundel of Bialystok, also a very critical commentary in the Siddur Otzer HaTfilos. And there what the Siddur Otzer HaTfilos does is begin to tell you, where did this prayer come from? Who authored this prayer? Why was it written? Why was it added? And you should know, not every prayer made it into the Siddur so easily. There were debates, there were controversies. There was significant disagreement and dissent if and when a certain prayer and tefillah could or could not be added to the Siddur. As I just mentioned a moment ago regarding Yigdal and L'Davar Hashem. But the Siddur Otzer HaTfilos is a very, very important work. Another critical work is the work of the Avodas Yisrael, Rabbi Seligman, who was a great German scholar. And what he did is actually look at all the great German Siddurim and begin to explain how Ashkenaz Siddur was written. And what Rabbi Seligman did is to organize and to bring the source material for different tefillos that were being authored throughout history. So if you're interested and you want to know, where did Yichvod come from? Where did Mizmor Lasoda come from? Where did Mizmor Shir Yom HaShabbos come from? Should it be recited? Should it not be recited? Where did Kabbalah Shabbos come from? And should Kabbalah be recited or not be recited? You take a look at Rabbi Seligman there, a commentary, the Avodas Yisrael Siddur, and there you will begin to see and appreciate and understand why it is that happened. 2 other very critical points before I take a look at some specific tefillos in terms of case study and appreciate what happened. Is there absolute authority over a word, a verse, a passage that's being recited? Can you add words? Should words be added? Can words be added? This was a tremendous machlokas Rishonim between the Rosh and his son, the Tur on the one hand, and Ashkenaz, the Rashba and the Avudraham on the other hand, in Sfarad. And this debate is very significant. Allow me to read you a tshuva of the Rosh. I'm going to translate it in English because that's how it is here in the book. And listen to the language of the Rosh. The Rosh writes, and Rosh is from the Gdolei Rishonim, one should not change the text and nusach of Shmona Esrei from that which the rabbis established. I have an old manuscript, says the Rosh, which lists all of the brachos of the year and the number of words in each bracha and what that number corresponds to. So like the Hasidei Ashkenaz, and the Rosh was a little bit earlier than the Hasidei Ashkenaz of Germany, the Rosh explains that every word is sacrosanct. You can't tinker with a Siddur, you can't add a word, you can't subtract a word. Was that appreciated, accepted by his son? It absolutely was. And the Torah and the Beis Yosef seem to indicate that this is the psak, that what is written in the Nusach HaTfilah of the Shmoneh Esrei cannot be tinkered with. But if you take a look at the words of the Abu Draham is Rabbi David Abu Draham, very, very critical commentary on the Siddur, from Spain, and the Abu Draham writes the following. There are those who count the number of words that are in each of the brachos of Shmoneh Esrei, and bring verses to explain the numerical significance. And I similarly did so in the beginning. However, later it seemed to me that this has no foundation and basis, because there is no place where one will find the identical words in Shmoneh Esrei, as some places add or subtract words. Therefore, the count is only for some and not others. So why should we inconvenience the scribes to arrange a word count? So that's significant. Machlokus between the Rosh and the Abu Draham. The Torah. How do we posit? How do we paskin? Can you or can you not? You tell me. Who's right? Is the Rosh right or is the Abu Draham right? What does history tell us? History tells us the Abu Draham was correct. Why? There's Nusach Sfard. There's Nusach Ashkenaz. There's Sfardi. There's a variety of different languages, even within the Sfardim. One of the Moroccans and the Iraqis and the Iranians, their Siddur, if you look at the Siddur of different dialects coming out of Sfard, you'll find upwards of 10 different differences, at least, between even the Sephardic community. And the same thing is true in Ashkenaz. If you take a look at the Beis Yosef, that's Rabbi Yosef Karo, I referred to moments ago, in Tzfas in the 1500s, posits like the position of the Abu Draham and the Rashba, that there is no absolute word count that is certain. Now, of course, the words are important. Of course, the word count is important. Of course, the numerological counting is significant, and it adds significantly, and the Torah does that. But because of the development of different nuschos, we appreciate the fact that words are changing, could be changing. This is what led to the tremendous machlokas between the Hasidim and the Misnagdim in terms of Nusach Sfard. And this is what the Chassam Sofer was very disturbed and adamant by, and angry as a result. And his student, the Maram Shit, fought this. And this is the machlokas that existed, but nonetheless it's been accepted that there are different nuskos in different languages, and different words that are used, and different counts that are used, and you can take a look in the Siddurim that shelve any shul and beis medrash and yeshiva and your home, and you'll find and study, and you'll see that there are different words that are being used. But here's one of the most surprising things that you will hear today, many of you will hear today, and one of the most troubling things about the Siddur, and this is where the Siddur becomes much more complex and much more complicated. And that is with the advent of the printing press. Who was running the printing press? Not Rashi, not the Rambam. Goy, most prominent, and especially the Italians. The Italians were running the printing press, and they had very significant authority over the printing press. And if you look in Shuvas throughout Jewish history, especially in the 1600s, the 1700s, and the 1800s, you'll begin to see tremendous debates that are even taking place between rabbinic authorities. Who printed that? You didn't have the right to print that. Where did that printing press come from? Where did they get my manuscript from? Who was able to print that? I only allowed that to be printed for 25 years or 50 years. You don't have the right to continue printing what was printed. And the Siddur began to be printed en masse, like many things were printed en masse in the time period when the printing press came out, and the printers added many prayers into the Siddur. And one of those tefillos that might be the most moving of all, that many of you are familiar with and come to shul for, may have been added by printers, non-Jewish printers, and that's the tefillah that everybody's familiar with. You come to shul Shabbos Mevarcha. The Hiratzon that the Ashkenazi community recites prior to Birchas HaChodesh, you will not find that in any Siddur, not of the Rishonim, not of the late Rishonim, not of the early Achronim, and in no Sephardi Siddur that you open up will you find that Yehiratzon. Where did that Yehiratzon come from? Now, we know who authored it. It was written by Rav, one of the great Talmudic sages. That's a Gemara Masechtas Brachos and Daf Yud Ches. But Rav didn't put that into the Siddur. There was no Siddur, as I described to you, in the Tanoim and the Amoraim time period. Who added that? Listen to the words of the Aruch HaShulchan. The Aruch HaShulchan, Rabbi Epstein was the rabbi of Navardik. The late 1800s and early 1900s, was not a rabbi who was afraid. He was not scared to say what had to be said. And the Aruch HaShulchan would lecture, and he would say, and he would print anything that he felt was important to say. And listen to what the Aruch HaShulchan has to say about this Hiratzon, and it's translated in English in the book. We should scream at the publishers of Siddurim, who added a standardized tefillah in the bracha of Shema Koleinu. He's not referring here to Berachas HaChodesh, but if you look in Siman Tav Chav Beis, that's what refers to the tefillah of Berachas HaChodesh, and he gets very angry, disturbed by anybody who adds. If you take a look in any siddur that uses, whether it's Art School or Koran, or any siddur in Lashon HaKodesh, you'll see in Shema Koleinu, there's a hiratzon that's added if you want to say something. Says the Aruch HaShulchan, who had the gall, the authority to add that into the siddur? Please, Hashem, I have sinned. Many who are uneducated add this plea to their regular Shmona Esrei, and my heart is troubled by this matter. I have heard that one of the great rabbis of the previous generation, I think I might know who that is, raised his voice about this matter. But due to our sins, the world is in the hands of the silly ones, and the publishers do what they wish, and nobody stops them. Never should a nusach become standardized within the text established by the Anshe Knesset Agdol. There are three places in the Aruch HaShulchan Orach Chaim that I'm familiar with, where the Aruch HaShulchan rails and rants about the publishers and describes and decries what they did. This is two of the places. Number one in Berachas HaChodesh. Number two is in Shema Koleinu, the addition into Shmona Esrei. But there's a third tefillah that many of you are familiar with, and this is coming in our tefillah in the coming month of Tishrei, and that is in the tefillah of Berachas Kohen. The Kohanim bless the nation. If you look in the siddur that you use, you'll see after each of the three blessings, there's something that you say. The first is Ribbono Shel Olam. The second is Ribbono Shel Olam. What's the third? Should be Ribbono Shel Olam, right? But it's not. There's a Yihiratzon there. In the book, I call this the curious Yihiratzon. Where did that Yihiratzon come from? That Yihiratzon is not what the Rishonim say should be said. It's not what the halachic authorities and the poskim say should be said. It's snuck in somehow, some way, and that's an entire chapter in the book trying to uncover and to figure out where that Yihiratzon is, and every single person says it here, I don't. Because the Mishnah says not to say that Yihiratzon. Chayadim says not to say that Yihiratzon. Kitzur Shulchan says not to say that Yihiratzon. But why is it still in the siddur? The publishers. And why wasn't it taken out? So as I described moments ago, in the 1800s and the 1900s, and in our time period, as more study and scholarship goes into the siddur, that Yihiratzon either was taken out, and certainly in the Siddur HaGra you're not going to find it, or that they put the Ribbono Shel Olam and the Yihiratzon, and they'll say the Yihiratzon is found in some earlier Siddur. But the influence of the Mekubalim in the 1600s and 1700s was so significant that the tefillos that the Mekubalim added into the Siddur, and again what the authorship and the authority and the origin of those tefillos are curious and challenging, but nonetheless appreciate that the publishers had a very strong hand in the siddur, and that also adds to the complexity and why the siddur is so cryptic, to try to figure out what should be said, when it should be said, and how it should be said. And that's why the Vilna Gaon and the Nusach of the Gra was so critical, because the Gra was very cautious not to add anything that shouldn't be added. No, there are 2 hours. Something like that. Let's, with your permission, just go through a few tefillos that we will say in the upcoming month. So I think that will be a good case study in terms of how to appreciate the siddur. Let's go back actually to Av for a minute, and this might be difficult for some to hear, but I want to speak about it because I think it's important to appreciate the significance of the siddur and the holiness of the siddur. If you open up any kinos today, you'll find toward the end of the kinos that are recited on Tisha B'Av, a kino or 2 or 3 for the Holocaust. Now, we just expect that that's there, and it should be there. That's something that I know I say with a lot of emotion that's very meaningful. My grandparents, many of them were murdered. My family, some grandparents survived, and that tefillah is very powerful. The beautiful tefillahs of the Tisha B'Av and the kinos are very powerful. Where did that come from? Who put that in? How did that make it in? Now, one answer is very simple. The kinos of Tisha B'Av are prominently focused on many different tragedies that happened throughout Jewish history, including the Inquisition and the Crusades. So why should we add a kina about the Holocaust? 2 of the great halachic authorities, one in Eretz Yisrael and one in America, Rav Shach, Elazar Shach in Bnei Brak, and Moshe Feinstein in America, were adamantly opposed to adding a kina for the Holocaust. Adamantly opposed. And the reason, and this I heard from one of the students of Moshe Feinstein, it's published, that Rav Moshe was concerned that as a result of individuals in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s who were adding tefillos to the Siddur, and I think you understand what I'm talking about, and we're taking things out of the Siddur, Rabbi Moshe felt that we cannot jeopardize, albeit that it's critical and it's important to add a kina for the Holocaust. Once we do that, we're giving and paving the road for other changes and tinkering in the Siddur. That was the original approach of Rav Shach and Moshe Feinstein. Roughly in the 1970s, an individual by the name of Rabbi Pinchas Herzka, who was a very influential, wealthy individual living in Borough Park, lobbied the Gedolei Yisrael and said, we can't do this. It can't be my family, your family, our families. We need to do something. We have kinos that are in the Seder HaKinos from the Crusades, from the Inquisition, and throughout terrible tragedies that took place, Ta'achdatat. How can we not add this? And he pushed and he pushed and he pushed. Until in the early 1980s, the Moetzes Gedolei HaTorah signed a letter, including Rav Moshe Feinstein, roughly 2 years before his Petir. Rav Moshe died in 1986. If I had this worked out, it was about 1984. Rav Moshe signed on, and in a very powerful letter, they acquiesced and agreed that the kinos should be added. Rav Shach held out. Rav Shach did not sign, and Rav Shach did not support the addition of the kina of the Holocaust into the nusach of the kinos of Tisha B'Av. Rav Shach's entire family, his students were all murdered. This is not an issue of sensitivity and concern and care, but it appreciates the importance of what can and what can't be added to the Siddur. And that's the kinos. This month, we recited, I mentioned moments ago, some of you recited this morning, the Davar Hashem Ori. Now you think that that's just very simple. You just add a passage called the Davar Hashem Ori Vishi. It's true. It's chapter Chav Zayin, parag 27 of Tehillim. But who added that to the Siddur? When did it begin? Who made that part of the crucial element of the Siddur of Elul? So the answer to that question is not so simple. And we're not absolutely certain when L'Davar Hashem Ori entered the Siddur, but we think, and we have good assessment, that roughly in the 1700s, and those are the students of the first generation of the Mekubalim of Tzas in the 1600s, there's a sefer called the Shem Tov Katan, there's a sefer called the Chemdas Hayamim. Sefer Chemdas Hayamim is its own lecture, requires an entire talk about the sefer Chemdas Hayamim, which is a very crucial sefer. Either it was written by a Kabbalist in Tzfas, or maybe it was written by none other than Nathan of Gaza. If you know who Nathan of Gaza was, he is a great Sabbatean, probably Shabtai Tzvi's right-hand man, and there are those who believe that it could be Nathan of Gaza. He was the one who introduced the Davar Hashem Ori into the Siddur. And it's for that reason that many Hasidim, if you look in the Chuvos of the Divrei Moshe, Moshe Halberstam collects tens upon tens of Hasidic masters and Hasidic sects who refuse to recite the Davar Hashem Ori because it may come from the Sefer Chemdas Hayamim, which may be Sabbatean. And again, is a very great debate in the Chacham Tzvi, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, and the great debate that took place as to who was the Sabbatean, who followed the Chacham Tzvi, who didn't follow the Chacham Tzvi. That wasn't just a debate of 10 years or 20 years. That debate continued for tens and hundreds of years until today. And the reason that some say L'Davar Hashem, some don't say L'Davar Hashem, is dependent upon that machlokas. And therefore you'll find many Siddur where you won't see L'Davar Hashem or Rishi. Many Hasidim don't recite it, many Sfardim don't recite it, the Bnei Shchai writes not to say it, and as I mentioned earlier, who else doesn't recite it? The Vilna Gaon. And in the Siddur HaGra you're not going to find it, but the Gra didn't say to not recite it because of the reason that I just mentioned, or the reason that he said not to mention, because number one, it's going to make your davening too long, and number two, it wasn't part of Dina Digma, it wasn't part of the original Siddur. That's Av, and that's Elul. How about a few tefillos in Tishrei? If you look in your Machzor, a very critical tefillah that you'll recite is Aleinu. Aleinu is recited in Malchios, and Aleinu is recited in the beginning of the Yom Kippur Musaf. Now, you're all familiar with Aleinu from Shacharis. You say, who added Aleinu into Musaf? Where did that come from? Who put Aleinu? Aleinu is like when I'm walking out. It's actually just the opposite. Aleinu originally was only found in the tefillah of Musaf of Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and it never existed in the Siddur HaTfilah of the Shachris Shal Yom. And if you look in the Siddur of Rav Amram Gaon, if you look in the Siddur of the Rambam, the Seder Tefillah of the Rambam, you're not going to find Aleinu. Because Aleinu was prominently placed in the Tefillah of Musaf Rosh Hashanah, because it speaks to Malchios, it speaks to God's kingship and God's authority. Who wrote Aleinu? Also debated. Most probably was written by Yoshua, but if you look in the Sefer Otzer HaTfilos, which I referred to moments ago, he suggests not. It was actually authored by none other than the Talmudic sage Rav. Because who established the Nusach HaTfilah of the Machzor, Malchia, Zichronos, and Shofros? It was Rav, the colleague of Shmuel. And therefore the Otzer HaTfilos, Rabbi Shlomo Gordon suggests that it was Rav who actually established and wrote Aleinu along with the rest of the Tfilah. So therefore it was taken from the Musaf of Rosh Hashanah, taken from the Musaf of Yom Kippur, and placed at the end of Tfilah. But it's the most critical Tfilah on Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, and it's a Tfilah that we trample on almost when it comes to the day. And it's true with many other Tfilahs as well. Anim Zmiros, in some shuls, is recited daily. Some shuls it's recited on Shabbos. Some shuls it's recited on Yom Tif. And some shuls it's only recited on Yom Kippur. Where did that come from? Who wrote Anim Zmiros? Subject to tremendous debate. If you take a look in the work, you'll see that it could be was authored by some of the Hasidei Ashkenaz, or the Chassid, arguably, possibly. There's some hints, maybe his student, his son, Rav Shmuel. But Anim Zmiros is also a critical part in many shuls and many communities, Leil Yom HaKippurim. So should it be recited? Should it not be recited? When should it be recited? This is subject to a tremendous machlokus between two of the great Acharonim, the Bach and the Lavush. The Bach writes, Rabbi Yosarkis is the rabbi in Brisk, that the tefillah and the prayer of Anim Zmiros should be recited daily. The Lavush, who was a contemporary of the Bach, says, absolutely not, it's too holy a prayer, it's no significant of a prayer, you can't recite that daily. This is a wonderful case study in trying to figure out what made it into the Siddur, what didn't make it into the Siddur. The Bach says to say it, the Lavush says not to say it. It's not found in the Siddur Rashi, not found in the Siddur Rakaf, not found in the Machzor Vitri. It's not found in the Siddurim of the Mikul Baal, Rabbi Yosef Karo, Moshe Kavera, and Rav Shlomo Alkabetz. The Lavush and the Bach debate if it should be recited daily or not. The Bach says he's heard it be recited for generations before, but the Lavush says he can't recite this daily, nobody's going to take it seriously. So let me introduce you to a Siddur, and with this we'll begin to close, Rabbi Shapsi Sofer. Rabbi Shapsi Sofer was commissioned by the Van Arba Artzos in the late 1500s and the early 1600s to publish the ultimate Siddur. The Siddur of all Siddur. The Siddur that would finally fix all the problems that we've been discussing for the last hour. Now we're going to have the ultimate Siddur. Rabbi Shapsi Sofer was a great scholar, a grammarian, understood Kabbalah, was well respected by his colleagues, and he was commissioned to write the Siddur of all Siddurim, clarifying and ultimately being able to solve all the mysteries and complexities of the Siddur. Let's look in the Siddur of Shapsi Sofer and try to figure out, would he include Anim Zmiros or would he not? And what makes this even more fascinating is that Rabbi Shapsi Sofer was a student of the Lavush who said not to recite Anim Zmiros, but he had a haskam and approbation from the Bach to the Siddur. So if you call that a conflict of interest and puts Rabbi Shapsi Sofer in a very difficult position, will he add Anim Zmiros daily? Will he not add Anim Zmiros? Will he follow his Rebbe, or is he going to be subject to the approbation of Rabbi Yosarkis, one of the leading rabbis in Brisk? Rabbi Shapsi Sofer also had access to the Siddur HaTfilah of the Maharshal of Shlomo Luria, a very significant Siddur, which was only in manuscript form then, and the Maharshal says not to recite it daily. What does Rabbi Shapsi Sofer do? He places Anim Zmiros on Shabbos. And that's the way he dances between the Bach and the Lavush. He doesn't leave it out, but he doesn't put it every day. He puts it into Shabbos. And any shul that recites Anim Zmiros on Shabbos is coming from Rabbi Shapsi Sofer Siddur. Now, did Rabbi Shapsi Sofer solve the ultimate problem in the year 1617 when this Siddur was published? Absolutely not. Because as we know, as history described itself, we didn't even yet have Nusach Sfard yet. We didn't have the Nusach of the Gra yet. We didn't have all the additions yet. But then, that Siddur of Shapsi Sofer is considered the Siddur of all Siddur. It's a Siddur that I use significantly when it came to working on the Siddur. And it's an important Siddur because Rabbi Shapsi Sofer collected all of the data and all of the Siddurim from the previous 6 to 7 to 800 years and organized and explained. A scholarly edition of the Siddur of Shapsi Sofer actually comes out of Ner Yisrael. A few individuals worked on the Siddur of Rabbi Shapsi Sofer. It's a 4-volume work and an excellent job that they did. And that is the Siddur of Rabbi Shapsi Sofer, and that's how he solved that problem. That's Anim Zmiros. Now, why is it that some shuls do not recite Anim Zmiros on Shabbos or on Yom Tov and only do it on Yom Kippur? The Vilna Gaon Aruch HaShulchan said, Chas v'shalom, to recite on Zmiros on the week, and Chas v'shalom to recite it on Shabbos. You're adding something to the Siddur that never existed before. You're making Shabbos davening longer. You're creating a tircha d'tzibur. Why are you saying Adam Zmiros? And therefore, the earliest source that we actually have of Adam Zmiros is found in one of the great halachic works of Ashkenaz, the Maharil, at the end of the Tkufa of the Rishonim, the Maharil, one of the great Chachmei Ashkenaz and the forerunners of Minhagei Ashkenaz, writes, there's one time a year to recite Adam Zmiros, Leil Yom Kippur. It's such a holy prayer, it's such a significant prayer. It shouldn't be recited during the week, like the Levush and the Marshal say. It shouldn't be recited on Shabbos and Yom Tov, like the Aruch HaShulchan says. But it should only be recited on Yom Kippur, and thus writes the Maharil that that's what should happen in many classical shuls, yeshivas, beis medrashes of Ashkenaz. The tefillah of Adam Zmiros is limited to Leil Yom HaKippurim, and that is it. So there you have it in somewhat of a sketch of the Siddur. I know the hour is late, I'm just getting going, but I know everybody has a busy day ahead of them. I hope that this is on some level giving you an appreciation of the Siddur, where it comes from, the background, the authorship, and the amount of work that went into it. I'll just finish by sharing with you something to think about as the Yom and Ram approach. Adon Olam, which is what every Siddur opens up with. Every Siddur opens up with Adon Olam. It's a chapter in the book. Who wrote Adon Olam? We don't know. We think we know. We have ideas. The Siddur Otzot Tefillah suggests 3 or 4 different people. The Siddur of the Beis Yaakov, Rabbi Yaakov Emden, suggests 2 people. But the Rabbi Moshe, who is a student of Reb Shlomo Luria, writes in his Sefer, and Rabbi Ephraim Zalman Angolius in the 1800s write that the Tefillah of Adon Olam should be recited the morning of Rosh Hashanah and the morning of Yom Kippur. And he says, I have witness and testimony, and I bring you a guarantor of the Gaonim of Igo. Anybody who recites Adon Olam with Kavan in the morning of Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, I guarantee that your prayers will be accepted. Many don't recite Adon Olam daily. Many don't recite Adon Olam on Shabbos and Yom Tov. Some recite it Leil Shabbos, some recite it at the end of Davening. Why at the end of Davening? It's only the beginning of the Siddur. It's not printed at the end of the Siddur, it's printed at the beginning of the Siddur. Who added it to the Siddur? Why is it at the beginning of the Siddur? You're going to have to read the book. But Adon Olam on Rosh Hashanah, Adam Zmiros on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, Yigdal on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, Aleinu on Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, all the tefillos that we trample on throughout the year, to a certain extent, those are the critical and key tefillos of the high holidays, especially Adon Olam. So as we prepare for Rosh Hashanah Yom Kippur, we prepare for Yom Nora'im as Elul comes, hopefully we appreciate and we are inspired by the words of the Siddur, the tefillos of the Siddur. I hope if a person is able to understand the background, the origination, the background of who wrote the tefillos, when the tefillos were written, why the tefillos were written, I hope and pray that everybody will appreciate tefillah even more. Our tefillah should all be accepted. Daven that it should be a good year, a happy year, a healthy year for each of you, for your families, for our community, and for all Klal Yisrael. Wishing everybody a ksiva v'chasima tova.